Welcome to Is Your Way in Your Way podcast, where your host, Cassandra Crawley-Mayo, helps you break free from obstacles and live life on your terms. Get ready to embark on a journey of self-discovery, empowerment, and inspiration. Tune in as we dive into captivating conversations with experts and explore topics that will ignite your passion and drive. Are you ready to unlock your full potential? Let's dive in.
Out there to all of my listeners, and I'd like to welcome you to Is Your Way in Your Way podcast. And I'm your host, Cassandra Crawley-Mayo. And for those new listeners out there, let me share with you what this podcast is all about. It's for individuals who are stuck. And what I mean by that, you know how you know in your heart of heart, there's something that you should be doing. It's like something is calling your soul and you can't figure it out. And then sometimes you kind of know what it is, but you just can't move. For example, you may want to write a book. You may want to start a business. You may want to change jobs. You may want to move. You may want to get out of a relationship. It's a gamut of things, but you're really struggling. And what happens is a lot of time our self-imposed barriers could be getting in our way. So therefore, this podcast are for those individuals that are experiencing that. And so we talk about topics related to your personal development or your professional. And it's also going to enable you to do some self-reflection on yourself. And today we have a special guest, but first of all, let me tell you the title is Overcoming Imposter Syndrome and Stepping into Your Purpose. And who better to talk to us about that is Kristin Chadwick. Good day, Kristin. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you doing?
I am doing so well. I am so glad to have you on this podcast, particularly talk about the neat things that you're doing, and also this imposter syndrome. And perhaps many of my listeners are stuck because of it. So we're going to talk about that. And before we do, I am going to share a little bit of your bio so my listeners could kind of get a understanding of what you are all about and what you've accomplished, although you have much more to accomplish. So Kristin Fields Chadwick is a seasoned podcast coach and industry expert with nearly a decade of experience guiding Christian influencers like the Dobson family and Kristen Boss and launching top charted podcasts. With a background in psychology and over a thousand podcast episodes to her name, she is specializing in help kingdom-minded entrepreneurs overcome self-doubt and confidently share their stories through podcasting. She's also a host of Holistic Hearts Podcast and podcast coaching for kingdom entrepreneurs. Kristin's mission is to empower others to create an impactful, authentic content that aligns with their purpose and faith. Wow, that's a lot. And listen, guys, because she's a podcast coach, I'm certain that she's coaching me right now, and she'll probably tell me about it later on. But I am so glad that she is here. Now, Kristin, what I'd like you to do now, it's interesting, you psychology was your background, and then you kind of pivoted over to working with podcasts, and now you were talking a little about imposter syndrome and stepping into your purpose. And I just have a feeling that you have actually stepped into your purpose. So what we'd like to know is, tell me about your backstory before you got into the podcast industry. And every role since then, I think since 2016, what was going on with Kristin?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with, everybody's story starts from the beginning, right? And
exactly.
So I have always loved working with people. I love hearing their stories. I love encouraging them. And so whatever position job-wise I had was always about that, whether it was a 5-year-old, I was a kindergarten teacher for 1 year, and then I was a personal trainer for a long time, and I was going to go back to school for counseling since my college major was psychology, and was like, I think I'm going to go back to school for counseling. And right at the last minute, I just felt I'm a woman of faith. So at that time, I was like, you know what? I feel a check in my spirit. Like it's a no. And so I called an unenrolled in the program, which was crazy. I'd already bought half of my books, and I really could not explain it other than I just feel like this is a no. And then a couple days later, one of my dear friends and her husband called me, and that is the Dobson family, and his son, Dr. Dobson's son, Ryan, was leaving Family Talk to go do his own podcast where he could talk a little bit more freely of things that parents our age at that time were really struggling with that you couldn't quite talk about on broadcast air.
Okay.
And they said, Kristin, we've been praying for a podcast producer, and you're it. And I was like, what is a podcast producer?
Right.
And I had honestly no clue. The only training that they really gave me, because Ryan was like, it's in your blood to be this. And he was like, you can come watch how my dad does it in his studio with their producer. But you're going to figure it out in the podcasting space. And so we did. We grew that show pretty quickly up to the top 25 kids and family. And I had a blast. I really loved, in my own comfortable spot, being behind the scenes and really creating a lot of connections for authors and them to create these amazing episodes back when podcasting was just starting off. And I loved that. And then gradually, as we continued forward, they really encouraged me to share my own heart or my own thoughts. So they would say, hey, Producer K, what do you think? And I'd be like, why are you calling me to speak? You guys are the Dobsons. You're good.
Right. Exactly.
I think with having Ryan and Laura, Ryan specifically, he's like a brother to me, and him saying, like, no, people really want to hear what you have to say. And then Laura she was walking through some cancer treatments at that time. And so I would record these little faith-based meditations for her, and she would listen to them, and she would be like, Kristin, you've got to put this on a podcast, and you have to record this. People want to hear this. And so 2020 was when I started my own podcast and shared more of my faith journey and those little meditations. And that's kind of how it started, but definitely went from not feeling like I had anything to bring to the table to understanding that God had called me to something a lot bigger than what I was picturing in my own story.
Okay. Now repeat again for my listeners. Before this opportunity came about, what were you actually doing?
What was I doing? I was training. I was a mom of 4. I had 4 littles at that time. And my training business was pretty much in my backyard and in our garage. So I would have other women come over, and we would train each other through boot camp classes. And that was it. And lots of just mom time.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's interesting because a lot of my listeners are moms. And also, although it didn't start out like that, but if you think about it, the training and you working with individuals and your group, you had it in you. So obviously Ryan saw something where you had to get out of your comfort zone. And you also indicated that you felt God was calling you to something, and what you were doing wasn't really it.
It was maybe not, it is not the right word. It was just more of like a beckoning for more. So there was a deep hunger to live into something bigger than what I could imagine at that moment. Yeah.
Okay. It's kind of like your soul, something was calling you. Like I indicated in the beginning, like I just don't know what it was, but then the door started opening. Yeah. So let me ask you this: why are you doing what you're doing? What's your why? What's driving this? What's your why?
Yeah, my why really comes from that story of there are women specifically all over that are gold mines that are hidden, that they just need to be brought out into the light and share their story. Because I really feel that we are called to bring hope into this world, and you have this nugget that could shift somebody's whole perspective, their life, their mindset. And that is my mission, is to cheerlead the people that are feeling that. It could be a very quiet whisper of like, oh, one day I want to write a book. One day I want to do a podcast, but oh, that's a little scary. And my why is to be like, yes,
Yeah.
let's fan that flame.
Okay. Now, was some of that imposter syndrome? How did imposter syndrome get in this thing?
Yeah. So
Well, first of all, what is imposter syndrome?
Ready to design your dream life? Join Cassandra Crawley-Mayo's Create and Design Your Best Life workshop. Break free from self-doubt and obstacles and step into a life of purpose and fulfillment. Click the link in the description to register now. Don't wait. Spaces are limited. Start living your best life today.
Yeah, it's the common question of who am I to blank. And I've seen this play out with lots of my clients in podcasts. I've seen it play out with friends in various, like job positions or projects or motherhood even. And so that question of who am I to blank has been personal in my own life. So even just starting a podcast in 2020 felt very real of who am I? I am a regular mom living my best life, my hard life. And so I know it's a very common question for, I would say, most people. And so God really took me on this journey in my own experience. And so the overcoming imposter syndrome really started with this conversation in my own faith journey. And 2020, everybody, the world shuts down. I'm very comfortably an introvert. I would much rather stay home. So I kind of was like, okay, I'll stay home. And then as 2021 and the world started opening up a little bit more and more, I felt like I needed to get out into our local community and network. And so I joined a networking group. And the moment I walked in the doors of this women's networking group, there were probably 130 women in this room in this very nice banquet type place. And I immediately was just stricken with anxiety and like, oh my gosh, I just want to turn around and go home because I do not belong here. And so every time I would go to these meetings, it was once a month, I would get that same feeling and I would have to try to talk myself into, okay, if you could just stay for 30 minutes, then you can go outside, take a deep breath, and just stay focused on other people and, doing all the self-talk of like, I'm trying to stay here. But that anxiety and that question of who am I to be in this physical room was very real. And so one morning I was having some time with Jesus, and I had this picture of sitting in the throne room, and the Father reaches down and says, Kristin, if you belong in the throne room, you belong in any room. And it really just hit me so intensely and really broke off a lot of fear in that moment of like, that is my identity. I know who I am. I know that I belong in here. And so little by little, as I began to play that phrase over and over in my mind, as I walked into whatever situation, whether it was the networking group or speaking or pressing record, I belong in the room. I belong in this room. You've opened this door for me to walk in and be present. And so that for me was so shifting that it's become such a tool and a framework for when I help podcasters start their podcast and they're starting to doubt of who am I to start a podcast, then that you belong in the room is core. And yes, who are you? So who did God make you to be? And what is the purpose and the mission that you're on through that?
Right. So it sounds like you've had an encounter, what I call an encounter with God. And, but prior to that, or I always say for me to have that, I have to have a relationship, for me to get it. And when you talked about that encounter, something similar happened to me at an airport. And I actually have that chapter in my book, and I had an out-of-body experience. And something went on with me. And it was something that I did that I would have never done. Just took control of a chaotic scene in an airport and just took charge.
Wow.
And when I did that, and after I did that, I sat down like, oh my gosh, what did I do? This is not my business. And this voice said to me, if you would get out of your way, you will see more things that I will do in your life. And that right there really, really helped me. And I'm like, okay. All right, I'm going to get out of my way. So I like that part about you had that encounter, and I'm certain you've had more encounters with God as I have. Now, with your you chose to work with women. Is there a reason why that is? And entrepreneurs, is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. Okay. I really think God is funny in that way of I grew up with 3 older brothers. And so my story was I loved being the quiet one and listening to them they were funny. They were outspoken. They were very entertaining. And so I was very quiet as the 4th kid and also the only girl. But through that, I really came to admire femininity and the power that women hold because I had seen the other side of it so much growing up. And so I just adore coming along women and being like, hey, your voice needs to be heard. And it's just ingrained in me because I feel like that was so much part of my story.
Yeah, that makes sense because, I think about when we're little children, we have brothers and the girls, and the boys, I think, are more outgoing. They're more competitive, and for the girls, just be quiet, you just sit right here, because I'm too am an introvert. And so I think too, that's kind of why we have had challenges speaking up. Because our childhood was like, no, you just sit, be like a little girl. Don't say anything. Yes, ma'am. That kind of thing. And the boy's like, because for me, women, to me, I think are hidden gems. And I'm like you, that's my ministry, to empower them to start living their best life on their terms, because we all have a purpose. We all are here for something. And so because of your gifting and your ministry, how do you find your clients?
So a lot of it is referrals. And that has been since day one of Ryan reaching out. And then while I worked with them, there were a couple of little things here and there that I would do on the side. And then once I started my own podcast and eventually left Ryan and Laura and let them kind of do their thing. And then I had another referral and another referral and another referral. And so my business really has grown by word of mouth and showing up and serving, I hope, fully well. And I have an amazing team that helps me along that process too. So it certainly is not by myself. I have 3 other women that work with me, and that is the majority of things is referrals, and then also podcasting. Podcasting has been a huge marketing tool to show up and people to hear maybe my style versus another person's style on how to podcast. And I know it's unique in its flavor. I'm not a very gregarious, striving person. And so I think we stand out in that way of just, we're genuinely for people. And so with our team and the way that they serve well, it just happens that way, referral wise.
Yeah, well, that's great. When you talk about the overcoming imposter syndrome, and for you, it was an encounter that you had with God. And I have listeners that don't have that relationship. What advice or what would you tell them? Or how could they overcome? Because to me, imposter syndrome is the phenomena. Everybody's talking about imposter syndrome. I forgot. It came out several years ago. It's relatively new, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how would you explain to individuals that aren't faith based, I would say, to overcome imposter syndrome?
Yeah. So I think we all question and we all have that imposter syndrome. And one tool is to really answer the question of, yes, who are you? And really sitting down and thinking about what do you bring to the table? And we all bring something to the table. So whether it's asking a spouse or a friend or a colleague, hey, what do you see in me that maybe I'm not seeing? And really sit with that and own it of, okay, this is who I am. And then from there is really looking back at what have you accomplished? What are those things that you can be grateful for that you have walked through and that you can carry forward as well? And I think that really does help. I've done a lot of interviews where I have talked about imposter syndrome. And I remember one guy in particular, he said, every time that I'm in a spiral of imposter syndrome, I sit down and I have to remember and write down everything that I've already accomplished. And he was like, it just grounds me. And I think that's so true, is just to remember what you have already done, even if you're in that space of who am I, or self-doubt, or doubting what's happening in the future or unfolding before you.
So for the individuals on my listeners, and even in my book, I talked about, is your way in your way? And imposter syndrome is actually one way that one could be in their way. And I've also experienced imposter syndrome, and it's a process. And at times I still do.
Yep. Absolutely.
So I always say, okay, I'm not there. I don't think I'll ever be there, but I will grow, and learn from that. And then after I grow and learn, that's the opportunity for me to save, to share, to serve as well with other women.
Yes.
You talked about how important it is for women to use their voice. And I had initially talked about as a child, being a child, how, when we were younger children, we were like, well, just be quiet. Are there other reasons you think why we as women struggle to use our voices?
Oh man, I feel like that's a loaded question. I do feel like culture, I think we've gotten a lot better, but I do think that culturally we have been told to be quiet, and whether it's directly or indirectly. And so I think that we're all starting to use this muscle. So it's fun to watch how women are starting to use their voices. And there's a big movement right now, like the Esther movement. I don't know if you know about the 1 million women march that just happened in Washington, D.C., but that to me just shows like this rising up of like, hey, wait a minute, we have something to say here. And and I think it just comes back to, we both, men and women, have incredible value. We are
Yes.
all valuable. And I think women right now are really understanding the worth that we get to bring to the table. And
Mhm.
so I just think it's a wonderful position to be in this day and age, to hear women rise up and share
Exactly.
their part of their story.
Right. And that's why my logo is a phoenix.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. Mm-hmm.
it's time to rise up,
Yep.
as you indicate, just what's going on in the world, the Me Too movement,
Mm-hmm.
you know, th- not having the right to our own body. It's just a lot of things. And
Mm-hmm.
I believe too, when you talk about the Esther movement, I'm not familiar with that movement, but I'm familiar with Esther's story,
Right. Yes.
and what happened with that story, and how that is a great way or a great metaphor to say that's a movement. That
Mm-hmm.
one woman, look what she did,
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, but I've not heard of that, but I think that's interesting.
Mm.
Take on the Esther movement. Wow. Um, do you, let me ask you a little bit about podcasting, because I have spoken with a few people, not a few, but a lot of people that are hanging on to this podcasting thing. Like, I've had people say, I really want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking about it, but I just haven't done it because it's tough. And,
Mm.
even when I started, I was like, what am I going to say? What am I
Yeah.
going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And like yourself, you have been a producer. So the whole thing. Myself, I'm all of it. I do
Yep.
everything. And it is a lot of work, but because of the love that I have for it,
Yeah.
it's okay. And I'm certainly eventually I'm going to have other people work with me as
Mm-hmm.
well, or work. I don't say for me, but we're going to work together.
Yeah.
So, talk to my listeners about how do you create podcast content that will engage your audiences?
Yeah, well, I think right there you said it well, of you love what you do, and I think it's following what is your heart for. What are those things that people know you love to talk about, or they come to you and they ask you questions about? What is it that you're constantly learning and curious about? And usually there is where you can find that sweet spot of your message.
Mhm.
And closely tied to that, I think on the other side of that coin is your who. And so if you have your message and your who together, you can really sit down and speak into the heart of your listener. So if you have that, then you can clearly create content from there. So it really is sitting down with that person that's like, I would like to start a podcast, and I
Right.
would ask, what is your why? Okay,
Yeah.
what's
Mhm.
the purpose?
Yeah.
And then from there we talk about that message in your who. And then from that point, it's more like the technical side of things, and
Mhm.
really understanding the depth that it might, or time and energy that it might entail for you, depending on which way you want to go with it. Is it a hobby? Is it a part of your business?
Exactly.
Um, so yeah.
Okay. Okay. Um, how could listeners, and you asked me this in the beginning, figure out who their audience is? And this is a another part two question. Um, and how can they, not only how do they know who their audience is, but how can they increase their listeners?
hmm Yeah. So those are two great questions.
Mhm.
The first part of how do you figure out who your listeners are is typically if you haven't started a podcast yet, you have this beautiful moment to decide who that is. If
Uh-huh.
you already have your business as an entrepreneur and it's part of your business, then you have your answer right there. It's those potential new clients or service
Mhm.
consumers or whatever. And so you can build it off of that. If you already have a podcast and you just started because you felt like you needed to start your podcast, then what's really fun is one client that I've been working with, she did that route, where now we're really focusing in on her specific listener. And
Okay.
the way that I literally just got off a call with her, And the analogy that I gave was, it's almost like you're a farmer and you've been spreading wildflowers and pumpkins and vegetables and potatoes and corn. And now we're like, okay, now that I've started, now I really know I want to grow potatoes. So I'm going to go over to this plot of content and I'm going to focus just on the potatoes. And I'm just going to let the other things go for right now, because I know the potatoes are really thriving in this environment. And so as a podcaster, as you, not that your listeners are potatoes, but you know what I mean. So you're like, for you, you're women entrepreneurs, you know, their age range, but so now it's like, okay, let's dig in. What are those pain points that they're walking through? And so I love to ask the 52 questions of what are those 52 questions that your listener is asking, and you just brain dump it out. So it could be, you know, how do I balance motherhood, business, and my relationships? How do I start a business? How do I grow my business? And you just go. And that is your content, basically. 52 questions. So that's one way, as far as really defining your listener. Another way is, if you already have a podcast, is to ask and say, hey, I'm going to throw a Zoom for my listeners. I would love to see who shows up, and just ask you a few questions, and really just talk to your people. And then you get to know them a little bit more. Now, the second part of your question of how do I grow my podcast? Well, this is like a whole thing in itself. And there are basically, I just did an episode this past week on basically how I would check over anybody's podcast to see where can we organically grow and where can we effortlessly grow, like intentionally grow. And so what I mean by that is, organically, like, what's your podcast art tile? What is your title? Does your title have keywords in it? Does your podcast description have keywords in it? How are people finding you? What ways can they find you better? And then you go over to effort-based marketing, and that's more of like social media, newsletters. How are you connecting with your people in real life? And just more of that effort-based, as the name says, effort-based. So those are kind of two areas where you can really dive deeply, and the result of diving deeply in both of those areas is going to give you growth organically and through intentionality.
Okay, great. That's good to know. Now, as we wrap up, tell my listeners, particularly those who are interested in podcasting. And I also see that you talked about you have 2 podcasting shows. Is that correct?
I do.
Yeah. Wow. Holistic. And what's the other one?
So Holistic Hearts podcast is more of the faith-based one, where the tagline is from the head to the heart. So we're really just getting deep into our faith.
Sure.
And then the second one is podcast coaching for kingdom entrepreneurs. And that is all about podcasting. So if you want to know how to start a podcast, head over there. If you want to learn how to grow a podcast, head over there. I even have a 10-part series on how to start a podcast. That's literally anybody could go through it and start a podcast after listening to that. And then, the growth, like I said, this past episode, this last week, is a great tool. It's episode 153 on growth.
Wow.
So,
yeah, you've done quite a few.
Yes. Yes.
So you can't, as I tell my listeners, you can't do things by yourself.
No.
Yeah, and that's one reason why I have my podcast, so people could listen to what other people are doing. Maybe they can be part of their community, their tribe, or maybe, as I indicated earlier, that it will enable somebody to self-reflect and have a pivotal moment and say, wow, okay, I did want to do a podcast. The thing that I remember is people always want to have a talk show. I want to have a talk show.
Yes.
Like,
Thanks, Oprah.
Yeah. So everybody wanted to have a talk show. So now I think the thing is, I want to have a podcast.
Mhm.
But I love the questions, the 52 questions that you asked to hone in to see whether that is really something that you
Mhm.
want to do. Is it a hobby or, for me, I don't just do things just to be doing it. It has to be a reason behind it,
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
kind of how I function. So any advice for my listeners who, like I said before, their soul is calling them for something, but they
Mhm.
can't figure it out. What
Mm.
could you share with my listeners to help them figure that out? And we already know once they figure it out, they got to take action. But
Right.
yeah, that's the key there. But how can they help them with like that something's calling them? How can they figure that out from your perspective?
Oh, man, from my perspective,
Mhm,
working with somebody, like a
mhm,
life coach or business coach, depending on what area you're kind of feeling that
mhm.
tickle in your spirit.
Right.
Um, and I think really listening to your own voice. It starts
Mm,
with that. I think, so often we go to other people to hear like, oh, you think I should do this? But see, coming back to women is this, we have an intuition. We all have an inner voice. And
yes.
sometimes it just takes sitting down and being quiet and journaling, or even just sitting on your front porch and
Mhm,
thinking about what is your heart longing to do? What rises up within you? Maybe it's almost like an anger that you see in this world that
yep,
frustrates you,
mhm,
or you feel the passion start to rise up, and really start to get real curious on that, and
mhm,
curious with yourself, and
mhm,
start to listen to those voices that
mhm.
are speaking to you.
Right. That's good. I think curiosity is another form of wisdom. To
Mm,
be
yes.
real curious about things. I think that's very helpful. And I'm also a very curious person. I want to know
Me too.
tell me about that. Well, why is that like that? All these questions. They're like, will you shut up and stop these things? But Kristen, this was great. You talked about your podcast. How can they get in touch with you?
Mm. Well, I would love to just chat with you one on one if
Uh-huh.
you're feeling the nudge to start a podcast, or I mean, you want to talk about anything we talked about on the show today, you can email me at kristin@kristinfieldschadwick.com. That would be the number one way to get in touch with me. And of course, I'm on social media at Instagram and Facebook at Kristin Fields Chadwick. So, and of course, my podcast.
Right. So, as you indicated, let's start overcoming our imposter syndrome and start stepping into your purpose.
Yes.
Again, Kristen, thank you so much. She's very much appreciative. And listeners, if you've heard something that's resonating with you, I would definitely take Kristen's advice and contact her, particularly if you're looking forward or wanting to start a podcast. Please give her a call. And for my listeners, again, share this podcast with individuals that have an interest in starting a podcast as well, or even want to know a little bit about imposter syndrome and how to overcome it.
Mm.
So, again, thank you, Kristen. To my listeners, bye for now. And remember, subscribe to Is Your Way in Your Way so you can start hearing more exciting podcasts on this channel. Thanks so much, and bye for now, and God bless you.
Hey, thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying our empowering conversations, make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of Is Your Way in Your Way podcast. Stay in the loop with all the latest episodes. Join our mailing list over at CassandraCrawley.com. And before you go, hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe now. Until next time, let's get ready to live your best life.